Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. McLaren confirmed that both Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri will be able to fight for themselves in the season finale in Abu Dhabi, but also making clear the absolute #1 goal is to make sure Max Verstappen does not win this World Championship, and they may be willing to employ team orders to ensure that happens. Lots going on at Red Bull as well, plenty to discuss today. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always. We are going to begin here because Arvid Lindblad, this was Lando Norris actually a few years ago in 2021 when Lindblad told him, look, give me 5 years, I'll be on the grid, and well, that's exactly what has happened as of today. These are the car launch dates that we know of so far, but the main announcement was as follows. We've seen this brewing over the last, frankly, months, but it was finally confirmed today. Isack Hadjar will be the next man into the Red Bull second seat blender. We shall see if next year's car is different, the reset of the regulations. Maybe if there's any time to go to Red Bull, now is the time. But I think Hadjar's deserved it on his performances this season. The podium in Zandvoort, the work that he's done for Racing Bulls. There is an argument. Should they have kept him in the sister team for another year? But again, we've seen so many drivers chewed up and spat out by Red Bull. Tsunoda has been another one. The attempt, I guess, is, well, maybe this time it is going to be different. And maybe, to be fair, it is. In 2026, the car is in a different spot. We know that Perez was not especially close to Max in 2021, but in 2022, when the regulations are reset, those cars were naturally very understeery in the first year. Max, of course, was stronger than Perez, but early days, it wasn't, extensively the case, and Perez at least held his own for the majority of that 2022 season. That turned around as time went on in that Red Bull camp. Hadjar, though, will be the next man to give it a go. Wish him the best at Red Bull, that's for sure, next season. And I think it is deserved on his performance. And also based on what has happened elsewhere, we've seen the great job that Antonelli and Behrman, for example, have done. I think you could well argue that Hadjar is still Rookie of the Year. Certainly a couple of months ago, it was an absolute no-brainer. The last couple of months, Antonelli's come on, Behrman has come on. I think Bortoletto was also looking good and then has had a difficult stint over the last few rounds. So you can probably argue different drivers might end up Rookie of the Season, but I think Hadjar and his performances has been pretty stellar. Outperformed Lawson the majority of the season. Had a couple of, off weekends as it were, but you'd expect that from a rookie driver, and he's going to get the drive next year alongside Max Verstappen. So that is their official lineup. It has been coming, but what, therefore, of Yuki Tsunoda? Well, he will not be in the sister team. There was some development on this over the last few days. As I told you guys yesterday, I was informed that Lindblad had been told he had this drive now for a little bit of time, not a massive amount of time. I think Lindblad was expecting, because he expected to get the promotion, and as well he should. He's done a solid job in Formula 2, but Antonelli, Behrman, they were in F2 last year, didn't do anything especially stunning, and they've been excellent as the season has gone on here, I would argue, in Formula 1. So I think it was expected Lindblad was going to get the promotion. He's been really the one that Red Bull have wanted to put in. He's done an excellent and very impressive job in the free practice sessions that he has done in that Red Bull over the last year or so. He was probably always getting promoted. When Lauren McKees came in, it did change things a little bit, because there was a little bit more of, well, Yuki, maybe we won't just sack him completely. Arguably, if McKees wasn't there, Yuki would maybe no longer be part of their program at all, but he still is. The question that emerged over the last few days, though, was, who are they going to have alongside Lindblad as their new rookie? Is it going to be Lawson still, or are they going to put Tsunoda back into that seat? Either way, for the long term of Red Bull, I don't think it really matters, but I don't expect Lawson or Tsunoda, if they were to be in that seat, to be around the Red Bull camp too much longer. Maybe Lawson can get himself promoted again at some point, but I think the chances of that are relatively slim. So that's confirmed on the driver lineups, but also confirmed that Tsunoda will be Red Bull's reserve and test driver. So the race did a video shortly after, which obviously they pre-recorded, where they said at the start, they may have changed it now, but they said he was not going to be part of Red Bull at all. And that, to be fair, was the theory. That was the rumour for quite some time, that Tsunoda would be ousted entirely and will no longer be part of the Red Bull camp at all. But actually, no, he will stay as their official reserve and test driver for next season. Can Yuki, as a result, find his way, fight his way back onto the grid? After this stint at Red Bull, it's going to be tough. But as we know, Sergio Perez, he benefited massively from the Lawson-Tsunoda disaster class that happened this season again in the Red Bull seats. Perez was bad last year at Red Bull. It wasn't pretty, right? Like, we're not going to do any sort of revisionist history here. But because Lawson and Tsunoda were just as bad, if not worse, it made Perez look better. Maybe he gets the drive anyway. But my point is that if Hadjar just absolutely collapses next year, which I don't expect, I do think that next year's car should suit those circumstances better, but maybe not forever. I don't know. Yuki will have to have some conversations. The man in the comments, he's got his wish, finally, so I suppose congratulations. The other thing is on Lindblad, right? Because he will be, on race day in Australia, 18 years and 212 days old, so only 10 days older than Antonelli was when he made his debut this season in 2025 at the Aussie Grand Prix. Remarkable, really, to have a driver who was not born when Fernando Alonso won his most recent championship, and that is quite the statistic. So he will become the 4th youngest F1 driver ever, behind Max, and Max's record cannot be broken based on the rules now. Stroll, Antonelli, and then he slots in there just ahead of Behrman, who of course debuted by surprise at the Saudi Grand Prix in 2024. That's the Red Bull lineup, Max and Isack. Is it the right decision from Red Bull? Time will only tell on that one. I think it's totally justified. I'm more intrigued to see how Lindblad gets on, frankly, because people were calling it the Behrman effect, right? Behrman did that debut drive for Ferrari, and yeah, it wasn't unbelievable. It's not like he podiumed, but he qualified 11th around a very challenging Saudi Arabian circuit, and then he went on to finish the race in 7th, which was very impressive given that he did not drive the Friday at all. Sainz drove the whole of the Friday. He then stepped out with the appendicitis. Behrman, I think, got one free practice session in and then was straight into qualifying around that circuit. So I think that showed, and Behrman's neck wasn't coping with the G-forces. I'm sure you guys remember that. But the point is, ever since that moment, the teams were like, damn, these rookies are actually kind of nice with it. And as a result, this season, we got a ton of rookies on the grid. We had Doohan, then obviously Colapinto to a certain extent, but obviously he came back in. He had a bit of a stint before, right? So did Lawson. But still, lots of younger drivers, Hadjar, Behrman, Antonelli, Bortoletto, and we're seeing more where that came from in the future. So I think it's exciting for the sport. Also, we have 22 drivers on the grid next season, right? With Bottas and Perez at that Cadillac team. That's all now been confirmed. Yeah, when Ferrari last won their Drivers' Championship in 2007, Lindblad was just 2 months old. Now, talking of Ferrari, there was a few interesting things said coming out of that camp. Of course, it was a disastrous weekend. P8 for Charles Leclerc, P12 for Lewis Hamilton. John Alessi even says, I am seriously worried about the future of Ferrari, saying development was stopped in favour of next season seems like a very weak excuse. And look, Ferrari have been saying, Vassar's been saying, they're not wrong precisely, that the gap nowadays between the teams is so marginal that if they're off the pace for whatever reason, this weekend they talked about the tyre pressures being too high for their car to cope with, whatever, seemed fine for the other cars, but apparently that's another weakness that the Lift Coast 25 has. So as a result, they were really struggling on, well, just getting grip in general all weekend long, getting the balance anywhere near the right window. And yeah, a few years ago, if you're a couple of tenths down on where you should be, that might be good enough for top 6, top 8, maybe at a bare minimum. But nowadays, that's potentially going to put you out in Q1 or Q2, such is the strength of the grid. And you might argue, oh, well, you know, poor Ferrari, right? In a different era, it'd be fine. But, like, no, they started this era as the fastest car, or probably not the best concept, but they had a very competitive car in 2022. To go from that point to ending the regulations in, I mean, a mid to lower midfield battle is frankly embarrassing. And yes, Hamilton did say, and he's not wrong, that he told the team to give up on this car a long time ago so we can fully focus on next year, which it does seem is what the team has done, but any more so than any other team, right? Like, how do we know? Is that going to pay off for Ferrari? And also, have they really? We know that Red Bull committed a lot to this title fight, and they might get their win with Max Verstappen in Abu Dhabi. McLaren stopped what they were doing quite a long time ago. That has been one of the reasons for the way the title battle has gone in the way that it has. But equally, who's to say that Red Bull won't come out next year with an equally good concept, or whether somebody else will deliver a good job? It's difficult, as John Alessi says, to have much confidence in Ferrari. Hamilton says, I'm just excited for the new generation of cars, because this has probably been the worst designed one that I remember, at least in my fate. Now, we know Hamilton's memory isn't great, but he's probably not wrong in some ways. This one, with the bouncing and the stiffness, all these things, has just not been an enjoyable period, and we have had the worst racing. none of us can overtake. What's the point in having a race if no one can overtake? And he was not wrong in Qatar. Not entirely the fault of the regs, but majority the fault of the regulations. I would say that Qatar is effectively unraceable in these current conditions. Not like Qatar's a great track, I'm not going to give it massive credit, but with these regulations, the dirty air that they currently generate and just the closeness of the field, it was just impossible to do any racing around Qatar this past weekend. Even Max said, not recently, but I think in 2023, when he was just dominating, he said that like these cars are not fun to drive. The drivers will not miss this era of regulations. The fans, I think, will miss some parts of these regulations. Probably some of the close racing that we will see vanish next year when the difference in Q3 is no longer 0.5. It's more like 1.5. But we'll see about that when qualifying arrives next season. What I thought was interesting about Hamilton was he said, I had a good first lap because he started on the softs, he made like 4 places, and then he was just stuck really. But he said the following, being critical, when I was in the driver's briefing, I asked them, this being the FIA, the question, why have you seen last year there was no overtaking? Why have you not, for example, increased the DRS? Because they restricted the DRS last year, and overtaking around here wasn't great last year and was always going to be worse this year. The cars get faster, the dirty air gets worse. The FIA literally said that, yeah, the dirty air's getting worse, but we've got too much to focus on, lads. We're not going to do anything about it. We're not going to do any technical directives. It is what it is. So you might have expected that they might have extended the DRS zone again. Hamilton says, why haven't you? And they say, hadn't thought of that. And Hamilton's like, what are you doing all year, right? I think it's also an argument for Pirelli. The 2-stop mandated did not help the race. The only reason why this race was in any way interesting was because McLaren massively messed up their strategy. Had they not have done, it would have been an outrageous procession for the entire Grand Prix. Like it might have been like one of the worst Grand Prix ever, excluding Spa 2021 and maybe Monaco 2024. But Pirelli, they had a whole year, a couple of years, to look at the tyres, figure out what's going on. Could they maybe have found a better solution than mandating a stint length? Apparently not. And Hamilton also went on to say this, the pit lane is 26 seconds. That's also an issue, right? The pit lane is really long. But Hamilton says that, well, actually, the pit lane ends quite early. It's just there's another bit of it, which for some reason is still pit lane. It also means that pitting is even more costly than it would be otherwise, because it's funny, right? You watch these pit stops in Qatar, they do the pit stop, and it feels like you're waiting half an hour for them to come at the end of the pit lane. Such is the length of the thing. And as he says, if you go to the end of the pit lane, there's a long space there that's unnecessary. Just pull that earlier. You could squeeze it down. So Hamilton had a couple of ideas that he presented to the FIA, and they said, oh, well, you know, we probably should have thought of that before the weekend started. So not a great sign. The final thing on Ferrari of the day is the 678. This was the 677 on your screen right now. The 678 is next year's car, which has apparently already passed the crash test homologation. I don't know if we've heard of any other teams passing it already at this point. Obviously, we're not far away from the tests actually happening, so there will, I'm sure, be a lot of confirmations here in December of teams passing that. Well, not confirmations, they won't announce it, but rumours that teams have passed the crash testing. There's always a debate on this. Do you want to pass the crash test first? Because that maybe means you haven't restricted as much weight as you should have done, possibly. We know that Red Bull, they often fail a couple of crash tests and then put a bit more weight and a bit more stability in the car to get to a point where they've got a good balance of what is legal, but also what is light. And we know that weight is going to be a problem with this upcoming year's car. So that's the Ferrari update, but let's talk about the title battle, because this is going to be the key storyline of the next week or so. Max is very much so in the fight. He wouldn't be if not for McLaren. Their disqualification in Vegas was especially egregious. The, of course, Zandvoort drama with Lando Norris as well did not help matters either. But this was Max's comeback, right? His gap to Piastri was 104 points. That then became his gap to Lando Norris in recent rounds. That is now down to only 12 points as we go towards the season finale. And last time we went to Abu Dhabi, just a quick reminder of what happened at turn 1. Lando Norris is out of this shot. He actually is in this shot. Lando came out of turn 1, went on to win the Grand Prix, clinched the Constructors' title for McLaren. But we know that Max Verstappen, he went for it down the inside of Oscar Piastri. They made contact around about where Carlos Sainz's car is, and then they both spun out of realistic contention. So major drama at the start of last year's race. Again, the front three from last year was Lando on pole, Oscar second, and then Max in third. And, well, we know how that ended, and it could be something similar this time around as well. Again, people are going to say, well, we're expecting all this drama and all this chaos, and sometimes it's just not going to work out like that. In the same way that there was some expectations of Turn 1 in Qatar being absolute terrorism, that never really happened, but there was still a change of position as many expected regardless. But Lando would love to be in this position in a few days' time. Of course, it's going to be far easier said than done. Max will not be unwilling to send something down the inside of Turn 1. They will need to be careful. The benefit, of course, at Abu Dhabi is that if you go off the circuit here and you decide to yield, there's no gravel, so you could potentially get away with it. And as we know, third place is enough this weekend for Lando Norris. Now, that is certainly not going to be good enough for Oscar Piastri after the disaster of Qatar. And in addition to that, it has now been confirmed that O'Ward will, maybe it's been confirmed for a while, but we've known this for some time, Pato O'Ward will be in Piastri's car in free practice 1 this weekend in Abu Dhabi. So not ideal for Piastri on a weekend where getting up to speed quickly is going to be very necessary indeed. Piastri also commented on the racing principles. It's been my opinion and many of your opinions that the reason not to box Oscar when they absolutely should have done was not just some miscalculation and some mistake, but was more intending to promote fairness between the two drivers or something like that. It's also worth keeping in mind, if Fernando Alonso wasn't deliberately driving slowly to protect his tyres because he knew he could get away with it because it was impossible to overtake, it would have been even worse in McLaren, right? Because they gained about 25 seconds on Alonso in about 14-15 laps. That the pace advantage of the McLaren is not a second and a half a lap, right? So if Alonso was pushing harder, they would have been into a world of hurt and a world of traffic. And, you know, maybe even Oscar would have struggled to get to the podium at that point. It could have been possible. So just to underline how bad McLaren's decision-making was last weekend, in some respects, P2, P4 was actually quite flattering, I think, to the way that things ended up that weekend. Now, Oscar says that was just a mistake. It wasn't about our approach. I'm not so sure that I'm convinced by that. I'm not so sure that Mark Webber is convinced by that either. Toto Wolff says that McLaren are feeling the pressure. So, look, here we go. What was said very interestingly, though, by Andrea Stella going into the weekend is the following. So, this is what he has to say. We want to be fair to our drivers. We want to race with integrity. We want to race in a way that does not surprise our drivers. So between now and Abu Dhabi, there will be further conversations with Lando and Oscar. We will confirm our racing approach. So look, they're going to talk about it and they're going to decide on, there's no more repercussions in the conversation. But the point is that going into Abu Dhabi, the drivers will presumably be aware, if certain scenarios unfold, what they will be expected to do in said scenario when it comes potentially to team orders. Now, we know that there was an understanding back in Monza from Oscar Piastri's side that when it came to pit stops that were slow, he was of the understanding and the opinion and the belief that the team had agreed that that is just part of racing, but then the decision was made, as we know, regardless. But what I certainly can say, says Stella, if any of the drivers is in condition to pursue the quest to win the title, then we will respect this. There will be no call which excludes the other driver when the other driver is in condition to win. So we'll see what scenario unfolds, but there will be conversations. We'll be going racing in a way that is united between the team and the drivers. So kind of interesting exactly what he means there, but I think the conclusion is they will allow Oscar to race for the championship. But there is a but in there, I think, as well, because they go on to say, we will leave Oscar and Lando the possibility to compete and pursue their aspiration. Oscar, from a points point of view, is definitely in condition to win the title. I don't know what he means in condition, but whatever. We have seen before in the history of Formula 1, when you have this kind of situation, sometimes it's the third one who wins it, as in 07, as in 2010. Oscar is fast. He deserves to be able to realise this performance. We will let the drivers be in condition to race each other, but above all, what's important for us is that we are in condition to beat Verstappen with one of our two drivers. So I think that final part is pretty crucial, because most of it, all he's saying is that, well, we're not going to make team orders so that Oscar's definitely out of it. We're going to give Oscar his fair shake of it. But they do make clear, now of course, it's easy to say, yes, we want to beat Verstappen, but if you looked at what McLaren have done over these last few rounds, you wouldn't necessarily believe that's actually what they're working towards. But the last thing he says is that the goal, I mean, obviously, but the goal is absolutely to beat Max. Now, we know that Zak Brown said that we'd prefer to lose to Max than to compromise on our integrity or some bollocks. But, you know, the point is that when it comes to this final race, if there is a situation where team orders might be necessary, I think they will be employing them, and they will be expecting Oscar Piastri to listen to them in those scenarios. But it does get a little bit complicated. I wouldn't say this is overwhelmingly likely to unfold, because if Oscar is in the lead and Max is in seconds, then there's no reason for, well, they wouldn't be able to do team orders, because in that position, Oscar would still be well positioned to win if Lando was further back, and Max wouldn't be winning potentially in that scenario. And even if Max was still winning, depending on where Lando was in the championship, but she wouldn't be, right? Because it's only a 4-point gap between them. So, yeah, in the scenario that Oscar's leading the race, of course, there'd be no team orders. In the scenario where Max is leading and Oscar is somewhere between Max and Lando, that's when things get more complicated. Now, it's not to say that's guaranteed to be the case. I think this whole team orders conversation is relatively unlikely, but it's certainly possible. Now, it's interesting for Oscar. Let's say Oscar is seconds and Max is leading, but, you know, what if Red Bull have pushed the limit on plank wear and Max gets disqualified after the race? Then, you know, does Oscar, like, okay, the chances of that are slim, but does Oscar want to yield position to Lando with the potential possibility that actually had he not done, he would have been world champion? But given the points gap between Oscar and Lando, I don't think that's ever really going to be so much of a viability. So I don't think that's too much of a concern for McLaren in that potential scenario. But it is absolutely possible that if there was a late safety car or something, that they might ask Oscar to pull into the pit lane, because Lando wouldn't be able to overtake him legally under the safety car or something, in order for Lando to gain a position or something that may be critical in the title fight. Again, if Piastri is in a position where on the final few laps it becomes increasingly clear that things aren't going to go his way for the title, then, you know, he has a decision to make. Do I allow Max to win, or do I yield and allow my teammate to win? I think there's only going to be one answer to that question, right? I don't expect Oscar to do anything especially unexpected in that scenario, but I don't know, the team is making it clear that they will have these conversations and they will discuss scenarios where team orders may be employed, and we'll see if they are required or not. But as I said, I'm not expecting a quiet title decider. It may be not as dramatic as so many fireworks as we expect, but I think the real question is, Lando's in a nice position, but so much pressure on him going into Abu Dhabi to deliver the qualifying laps, to race at the extreme. Like this weekend, we know there was some pressure on him. His pace wasn't very good. We know that he's only got to be third, but yeah, it's all to play for. Just to mention this before we close out, because this would be remarkable. Norris led the championship for the first 4 rounds. Then in Saudi Arabia, Piastri took over the lead, led for the following 16 or so, 15 rounds. Then Norris took over the lead again following Mexico and has led the last 4 rounds. If you showed this to somebody who was not following Formula 1, they would say, probably Norris is going to win. Is Piastri maybe in position to fight back? They would certainly not expect that the answer to this question could still be Max Verstappen. And it was actually the same as in 2010. And in 2010, you had a ton of different drivers leading the championship. Alonso, Webber, Hamilton, Massa, Button, I think, was also leading the championship at some point. And then right at the death, as we know, it was Sebastian Vettel who came to win. Having never led the championship all season, Vettel won from 3rd in 2010. So who knows whether we could see something similar this weekend. But hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.